Okay, thank you. Hi, this is Ames Gross, President of Pacific Bridge Medical, and thank you for attending our webcast today. We have our Ms. Wang, who's in our Beijing office, who's going to make the presentation. And the presentation will last 1 hour, and then we'll have 30 minutes of questions and answers. So Ms. Wang has been working in the drug markets, the Asian drug markets, and the Western drug markets for over 20 years. And she's going to start the presentation now. So go ahead and start, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Ames. This is Dianhui Wang with PBM and based in Beijing, China. And good morning to everybody. And actually, Ames, can we go to the next slide, please?
Right, 1 second. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Is it moving? Okay, great. Thank you. So basically, it is my pleasure to share with you on some updates on China's pharmaceutical business. And today's focus really is going to be around the regulatory front, specifically including drug regulation, approvals, as well as market access. And next slide, please. Next slide, please, Ames.
Yeah, it's up.
Okay, great. So we will start with a few high-level, just the background overview. First of all, the size of the Chinese pharmaceutical market in 2011, it was another very exciting year. The total prescription market in China reached over $41 billion US dollars, and the market has been growing at over 20% year after year since about 5 years ago, and still will sustain that growth momentum for the next 5 to 7 years. And actually, probably most people already know, China has become the third largest global pharmaceutical market right after the U.S. and Japan markets. And next slide, please. And just want to remind everybody, I think obviously there are a number of positive forces driving the overall rapid growth, and actually not the growth, but the transition of the overall industry. In the home front, internally, there are some positive economic factors and lifestyle changes. I also think the whole healthcare reform has been a tremendous driver, really driving some fundamental changes in the overall healthcare sector, including the pharmaceutical industry. And obviously, the global pharmaceutical industry is undergoing some structural changes. I think timing is really good for China to catch up in this round of globalization and to become a meaningful player as a force for drug development, for innovation, as well as a huge market for pharmaceutical products. Next slide. And the pharmaceutical business, as we all know, is highly regulated everywhere, and there's no exception in China. And we just want to highlight here, along this very long and complex value chain in China, perhaps the biggest, the most important stakeholder here is the government. Next slide, please. And here we just try to demonstrate at the highest level some major governmental bodies involved in this industry. The Ministry of Health, and SFDA stands for State Food and Drug Administration. So that's the central FDA, so to speak, in China. SFDA is under Ministry of Health. In addition to Ministry of Health, there's also Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security. So that is the MOHRSS. NDRC is a very unique governing body in China. It stands for the National Development and Reform Committee. Really, they they're in charge of pricing and some other regulations, and really in the pharmaceutical business or for the pharmaceutical business, their involvement by and large is really in the price setting arena. Next slide, please. And the next slide really shows the intricacy as to who does what among different governmental agencies along different aspects, all the key aspects in the drug business, from regulation to CMC, GMP, quality control, pricing and reimbursement, and essential drug list is another unique area in China, and tendering, bidding process, and clinical trial, and some other things. So really different agencies, their responsibilities in different areas, and who's in charge of what, and who actually play a sort of a secondary or influential role in what areas. And also, just want to highlight not only the central government, different bodies, but also this is also a matrix sort of a setup. Provincial government bodies and agencies or bureaus, they're also heavily involved in different aspects of the drug business. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so that's kind of the highest level what's going on in the market. Then we're going to spend some time on drug regulation, drug approval. Next slide, please. Obviously, a series of provisions and guidelines and regulations, they're put into place to really govern and monitor the overall drug industry. The scope of the regulations, I think it's quite similar to other countries, from really IND stage to CMC to NDA submission approval, and there's SNDAs, and also renewal of license. That's quite unique in China. But when we talk about regulations and what to do at different stages of a drug development program, just have to make sure you need to understand that based on the types of the drugs. Obviously, there are new drugs, there are generic drugs, and also imported drugs. So when we get into that segment, imported drugs, we'll talk about what does it mean by an imported drug and what you have to do versus locally produced drugs. New drugs is quite unique in China in terms of classifications. And the next slide, please. Next slide, please. The new drug classification. Actually, TCM is very, TCM is very unique in China. It's called traditional Chinese medicines, and the botanical drugs, they are also grouped into TCM. So if you have a botanical drug according to the FDA in US or maybe EMEA in Europe, if you want to introduce that drug to China, it would be under the TCM/botanical drug category. But we're not going to spend too much time on that, because we believe most of you probably have small molecule drugs and perhaps biologics as well. So for instance, if you have a small molecule or chemical drug, there are actually 6 categories or classes of chemical new drugs, from class 1 to class 6. Actually, class 6 since about a year ago has been separated out. So that's the generics. That's middle of 2010. But before that, generics, actually, there wasn't a generic division within the SFDA in China. So prior to that, generics, they were reviewed and regulated by the same, basically, chemical drugs, along with some other new drugs together. So for instance, for chemical drugs, there are 5 classes The first class really molecule has not been approved anywhere globally, either in China or outside China. And class 2 just say this molecule perhaps has been approved somewhere else, but this or even in China, but this would be a new route of delivery. For instance, if the approved route of delivery has been injectable, if you come up with an orally delivered, that would be classified under class 2. Then class 3 basically is already approved outside China but has not been in China yet. Then when you have a new form of salt of a already approved molecule, that would be a class 4 new drug in China. And when you have an approved molecule, but this is a new dosage form, maybe you have a tablet, but you come up with a self-gel, that would be a new dosage form. So that would be a class 5 in terms of a classification. The biologics, the classification is even more complex. So we decided not to spend too much time today here, but we certainly can more than happy to address your questions later on if you have any questions. The whole classification for biologics are still very vague. The classification based on product types, whether it's a blood type of products, whether it's vaccines, whether it's anti-TNF or antibodies or whatsoever. So it's very complicated. The government or the SFDA is considering how to regroup them into some more manageable forms and types, but we'll see what's going to come up. And also we have to tell you here, and many of you probably already know that, for instance, for chemical drugs, there are 5 broad classes, but actually under each of the broad classes, there are also subclasses as well. Why they're important? Let's look at the next slide, please. Okay, so we have a table later on to talk about why subclass is also important. So let's talk about applications by product type. So for instance, for a generic drug, now there's a new generic division within the SFDA. In China, I think in the U.S., generics basically is, it's a bioequivalent drug to a drug already off patent. It's AB rated, and there's no AB rating or substitution system in China. But the definition of a generic drug in China, small molecules, is quite similar to the definition in the U.S. So the official, the language here really says they already have national standards. So the drugs here, it really means not only molecules, but dosage forms and strengths. So basically, if you have an identical dosage form and strength of the same molecule to an existing approved product, so that's the generic, or maybe listed in the Chinese pharmacopoeia. And this class, the generic applications, they are applied to, as we said, the class 6 of the chemical drugs. They have become independent already. And also in TCM, also biological product categories, there are also so-called generic products as well. But whether it's biogeneric or biosimilar in the biological category, there's no clear definition in China. But you probably have picked up the word preventative. It's here really applies to some of the vaccine products. Next slide, please. Imported drug. It doesn't matter if you have a drug, whether it is a generic or it is a NCE or NME. If you want to get an imported drug to China, you have to follow this route. So imported really means if the drug is manufactured outside China, and manufactured, the definition of that is if the dosage form is manufactured outside China. Some companies, they probably do the tableting and the dosage form manufacturing outside China, but they got the bulk into China for the final packaging. That would be considered as a imported drug. So you have to follow the imported drug application route in China. Next slide, please. When we talk about registration supplements, similar to the U.S., when you have a drug already approved, you come up with some new dosage forms, and you have to change maybe the ingredients or some other things. So you basically submit a SNDA. So very highly specified classification here. Really, there are in total 33 kinds of supplements. A little tricky here because the new drug classification sometimes versus a supplement can be tricky here. Whether that particular new stuff would be under the whole supplement regulation, or that would be considered a totally new product. It can be very tricky, and sometimes there really isn't a black and white answer. You have to negotiate with the government. So that's the registration supplements. And also, I think I mentioned in China, many, maybe all government bodies or agencies, and certainly for FDA or SFDA the same, the central SFDA, they oversee and govern many aspects and procedures and decision-making process for the drug business. But also at the local level or the provincial level, the provincial drug authorities, they are also involved in different aspects of the drug business, even in the supplement submission. Certain minor changes, perhaps just basically managed by the PDA, the provincial drug authorities, rather than you have to submit everything and negotiate and get a final say from the central SFDA. But all of that, under what situations and circumstances where you should go, there's, everything is clearly illustrated, kind of a flow chart. Just follow the flow chart. It's very pragmatic sometimes, because when we talk about later on about drug development and other things, you would get little face time with the authorities, everything based on documents and regulations and guidelines. Then you really have to read those documents and guidelines very carefully, and you probably need to have some good relationship with some experts inside the government agencies and try some informal confirmation or suggestions from those experts. Next slide, please. Also, application documents for new drug registration. That's where I said we will show you a series of slides, but we're not going to get into all the details. The submission of new drug registration application, the whole CTD format, that's following the CTD format, that has been a new thing since about a year ago, even less than a year ago. So the whole system in terms of technical document has become very consistent with the ICH guidelines. So I think it's a good news, especially for foreign companies and for imported drugs. When you have existing dossiers and documents from other markets, from other countries, you basically can use those materials from existing dossiers and submit them in China, as long as you can follow some specific requirements required by the SFDA. Next slide. I think it's a very important summary. Basically, we mentioned there are 5 different classes or 6 classes, the 6 classes generic new drugs under small molecule division. And there are different sessions. There's a general summary, and then pharmaceutical research session, then pharmacology, toxicology, and clinical data, and so on. What specific information you need to submit, you need to have, everything is itemized. Then it's based on not only the class of your new drug, the class of your new drug is really determined by the SFDA, but also the subclass. For instance, if your new drug is designated by the SFDA as a class 3.2, then there's a table would be shown by the SFDA, hey, this is the checklist, just do all of this according to the checklist. And the checklist can be as specific as, for instance, a bioequivalency study, you need to have 16 pairs of patients, subjects, or you need to have 32 pairs of subjects. Phase 1 and phase 2, and if you already have, clinical trials, phase 3 studies conducted overseas, how many patients of the trial you have to do in China. And if you already have, even you have maybe large body of a preclinical evidence, yet you just need to make sure what else preclinical data the SFDA may ask you to do. So there's a very specific detailed checklist would be provided by the SFDA. And the next few slides, and let's move to slide 15, we just basically listed out all the detailed materials you have to submit. The summary session, that's all the drug specifications, right, from the name to the dosage form and product insert you already have overseas, and as detailed as possible. But basically the general background information. The next slide, please.
Yeah, Don, I think these slides are fairly self-explanatory. So why don't we...
Okay, yeah, we'll just the next slide is the pharmaceutical research session. The next one is the pharmacology, toxicology. The last one is really the clinical development segment, what data you need to submit. Can we go to the next, please? Next one, please. In summary, so it's very self-explanatory, very fair, detailed. Perhaps there's some maybe downsides. I think I already mentioned that. Got little face time to discuss and negotiate. By the SOP, there's really a little negotiation with the government authority. However, you really better do that, get some informal opinion from the experts. Even you get those, we said here, informal opinions, because really by law or by regulation, for instance, there isn't, let's say, the end of a phase 2 meeting. And even there's a meeting, let's say informal meeting, you have meeting minutes, but that is really not binding, not legally, but not binding, meaning, if they say that's okay today, but that doesn't guarantee it 2 years later. So get really sort of insider insight is extremely important. So I think, along here, we would highly recommend you better have local experts, like local CROs or maybe local regulatory experts to help you through. Just make sure whatever you are going to do, either phase 1 or phase 3, you better do it eventually can meet the SFDA requirement. So they would give you little upfront legal direction. They would say, this is the document, this is the regulation, just read it and just do it based on your understanding. And otherwise, I think it's quite consistent with other countries. Okay, the next slide, please. The application sort of a review and approval process for IND. It is not called IND in China, but similar to that. Nothing special here, but pay attention to the whole thing. If this is a local product, it starts from the provincial drug administration authority rather than start with the central government. So the provincial government agency would basically do a sort of a checklist checking on the dossier components, and there's a site visit inspection, but it is possible. So it may happen, it may not happen. That's number one. And number two, the whole review and approval of the so-called IND and also the approval for new drug manufacturing, that two processes are conducted or carried out in parallel, really by the same government authorities. So when you need to get both approvals or certificates before you can initiate a in-human clinical study in China. And that process, IND process, next slide, please, takes very long time in China. I think still it really frustrates many foreign companies. For instance, in the U.S., when you submit IND application, there's a 30-day stay, whether they say, hey, sort of tell you it's acceptable or not acceptable, then 60-day review whatsoever, then if you hear nothing from the FDA, you can basically say you can begin your activities, but that's not the case in China. The whole IND review and approval can take minimally 7, perhaps even as long as 9 to 10 months, and especially if it's an imported drug. So, as I said, for locally produced product, the whole process starts with the local authority. But if it's imported drug, you basically begin the whole submission with the central government, SFDA. By standard, it says takes 20 days or 3 to 4 weeks longer than local products. But in reality, it varies a lot. Really determined by how complex your product or the history of your product overseas and the quality of data you already have or you already submitted to the SFDA. But the IND process is very, very long. The government has said almost 10 months ago, they're willing to streamline and reduce the timeline on IND review and approval, but still not, there is no sort of revised and improved process introduced yet. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Donwee, I think we got to pick up the pace a little here to get to
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So next slide really is if you have a imported drug, the IND takes 7 to 10 months. Then in general, the whole process can be as long as 3 to 4 days. Even you have pretty comprehensive data overseas. So the IND stage, then step 2 is conducting clinical trials. Then you would submit the NDA application. That takes 7 to 15 months. Generic product shorter, 6-7 months. Then if this, NDA rather than so-called ANDA would be at least 12 months. So that's the kind of the timeline you can be expected, especially if it's imported. There is a so-called expedited approval process introduced a few years ago, but the definition is still not clear, but at least it shows the willingness from the government. It is willing to for certain disease areas, rare diseases, cancer, oncology, immunology area, the government is willing to reduce the review process, but there's no clear definition. There has been a few successful stories, but what is the criteria? It's really hard to say. The green channel, so-called, about 2 to 3 months you can save from this expedited review green channel. Next slide, please. GMP, the quality side of a new drug, that actually has been almost like a revolutionary area in China. It has done a lot helping the whole industry to modernize and really to increase really quality of pharmaceutical products in China. We're not going to go through the details, but the history has been fairly short, started only about 30-something years ago, and until actually early last year, March 2011, the current GMP version was introduced and started to be implemented that time, less than a year ago. Basically, the current GMP, can we move on to the next slide, please? The current GMP is a very consistent adaptation of the ICH system. And the government has sent out very clear message to everybody in the industry. All plants, local plants, have to pass the new GMP by the end of 2015. It's a large, really, the bar has been raised much higher than previously. And we expect actually significant number of small plants, they probably will just need to shut down because they don't have the money to do the upgrading, and it can cost a lot of money there. Then also a few local companies, they tend to be quite large. They have chosen to pass the U.S., the CGMP, because they really want to play a role in the global market. And those manufacturers actually, they not necessarily say, hey, my whole plant or manufacturer site will pass the CGMP or the CEGMP. They basically perhaps just choose a certain product line if they believe they have a high potential product for overseas markets. They have already actually chosen to get that product line upgraded to the standard of CGMP or the EMEA GMP requirements. So I think that's all just very positive moves in the industry. Next slide, please. Drug development in China, just want to show you some figures. How many INDs approved historically in the last few years, and you can see, basically you can tell how many basically clinical development programs in China. Perhaps you are able to see here, actually it's a significant drop from the almost 1,500 IND approval in 2006, later on to 2007, 700, not less than 800 something. Really as effort of the anti-corruption reforms, because prior to that, there are lots of under-the-table deal. You basically could pay the government and you get approval, you get a certificate. So significant crackdown. And eventually the number has been stabilized. I think for the 2011 summary is not published yet. But you see it has basically stabilized. I think 2010, especially 2011, will really, how many imported drugs, for instance, that really shows, I think, the state of the overall global pharmaceutical business, and it's almost like less relevant to the state of the local pharmaceutical business in China or the pharmaceutical industry in China. On both new molecules and generics, local products, you see the new INDs basically has been declining year after year. That is really true. The government has raised the bar. The government doesn't want to have too many generic products on the market. And if you want to have a new product, you really have to pass the standard. What's the definition for new? So really you see the government, even from this whole drug development IND approval process, you can see the government is really encouraging more innovation, more and more innovation in China rather than just pure generics. Next slide, please. Another unique aspect, clinical development in China, clinical trial sites. All the trial sites, they are certified by the SFDA, and they're all affiliated with hospitals. So that's the situation in China, because really most physicians and thought leaders, they're all in hospitals. So how many trial sites here, and also here's a summary, just, the government intends to cut the review timeline. Also, the government really encourages more international multi-center clinical trials. I think many foreign companies also talk about it. Lots of talking. I think we're ready to make some breaks there, but still not yet there. And also very interesting on some pan-Asian efforts, regional collaboration, China, Japan, and South Korea. The governments, they get together at least once a year, perhaps sometimes twice a year, to talk about pan-Asian trials. I think perhaps we'll start to see some meaningful collaboration activities or initiatives among the three countries, rather than the real, the international multi-center clinical trials. We talk about the CTD format and the GMP. Yeah, that's sort of in summary what's going on and the highlights in drug development in China. Okay, I think we're moving into next. This is more about market access, pricing, and reimbursement specifically. Next slide, please. We just talked about registration, approval of a new drug in China. That's really doesn't mean after you got a new drug approval, doesn't mean, hey, next day I can go out to sell. It can take very long time, up to 15 months post-approval to, you sort of can commercialize your product and physicians can begin to prescribe your product. So that's really the market access process in China. You have to have the price of your new drug approved by different government agencies. That's 4 to 5 months. Then when you have a price approved, retail price approved, then you can, with the SFDA, NDA approval and the price approval, then you can participate in the provincial level bidding, tendering and bidding process. So then, meaning if you can win the bidding, then your drug will be selected and your drug can enter the distribution system in that particular province. And after that, you need to go to each of the key hospitals you want to target and to get your product so-called listed or included in the hospital in the hospital product formulary, so that all the physicians in that hospital would be allowed to prescribe your product. So each of the steps can take minimally 3 months, perhaps 5 to 6 months. And you have to do that province by province. And with hospitals, you have to do that hospital by hospital. So that's the reason why it takes so long. On the other hand, many companies, not only Chinese companies, but also large foreign pharmaceutical companies, they're getting very, very, very sophisticated in navigating the whole process here. Some of them, they can probably do just, a couple of months. I think Bayer, they launched that, factor 10 new drug. So basically they launched 2 weeks after they got NDA approval, because they began this whole pricing, bidding, and hospital listing process way long before they got the SFDA NDA approval.
Okay, Don, I think we got to pick it up a little here.
Okay, yeah, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. Regarding pricing, different product types, we'll mention very briefly. There's the EDA, the Essential Drug List. There are also National Reimbursed Drug List, NRDL, and really different lists in the NRDL, List A and List B, just, who controls that, who decide whether you can be part of the EDL, whether you can be part of RDL, whether it's a national RDL or provincial RDL, and how the price setting mechanism based on different product definition. The next slide, in addition to EDL and RDL, the next slide I think we also have, if your drug is not on RDL, what does it mean? And if you have an imported drug, basically imported drug would be treated no different from locally produced. Your drug may be eligible to be included in RDL and may not be. Okay, next slide, please. The price setting process, why it takes so long, 4 to 5 months, and there are largely speaking 5 different steps how to set a price. And really the price setting here, you just want to make sure the government would set the retail price, and they set the retail price based on the cost of your product. So you have to disclose the cost of the goods for your products. And if it's imported, you need to have basically cost of the goods overseas and also the insurance and freight costs and so on. So that's the 5-step long process to get a price approved by a provincial government. Next slide. We mentioned the RDL. We'll talk about RDL. What is RDL and how the RDL drug price is set. But most products actually, they are not included in the reimbursed drug list. So they're non-RDL drugs. So here we just tell you the very specific information. If you're not on RDL, your price would be determined by the local pricing bureau, and the information you have to provide in order to discuss and negotiate with the government and eventually to have a very favorable price set and agreed by the government. Next slide, please. NDRC, we mentioned that central government agency, the National Development Reform Committee, with respect to pharmaceutical industry, what they do in NDRC, basically the price. And also here, historically, here we showed you just a number of price cuts about, from 2004 to 2009. Actually, very interesting if we look at the next slide, and to many people's surprise, the next slide. In 2011, NDRC implemented 2 rounds of price cuts. And every round is now to say every drug, the price had to be cut. So they basically select a number of molecules, a number of therapeutic areas. And the 2 price cuts in 2011, we believe, really as an effort to ease the inflation going on in China. So just make sure to really reduce some economic burden on really average people here. New pricing mechanism here is just say what's going on right now and versus what's going to happen in the future. Basically, right now you have the RDL drugs, the price controlled by the government. But moving forward, it looks like the government may take control over majority of drugs. So many companies, they're a little concerned by that. Well, if, if I'm not on the RDL, perhaps I can set my price somehow more freely as long as I can get the local government permission and as long, patients are willing to pay. But that freedom, it looks like, there is a trend, perhaps more drugs will be taken over by the government authority in terms of price control. And the price structure too, you need to disclose your cost of goods sold right now, but there really isn't a say, hey, as a drug manufacturer, you're allowed to make only 15% or 60% profit. There isn't a quantified, standards or principles to follow. But moving forward, the NDRC is discussing that. Hey, for innovative drugs, we give you a higher margin, but there's a range. It's not like, totally free up to you. Then off-patent drug and generic drugs too. There are, long history of sort of innovative drugs in China. So right now the situation here is if, for instance, Plavix is still on patent in China. The Plavix, when the patent expires, there isn't a so-called cliff phenomena in China. After the market, the generics to compete, then Plavix has to drop the price by, who knows, maybe 90% overnight. That's not the case in China. If I have Plavix, like Sanofi, if it's selling at maybe $100 a month right now, if tomorrow it's off patent, I may still selling at that point. It's okay. There's perhaps little competition. So innovative drug versus generic drugs, how they're priced. But that's the current situation. Moving forward, there would be some mandatory price cuts for innovative products as soon as the patent is expired. So that's, the current situation, what may happen moving forward in the future. We mentioned RDL. It's a very complicated system here, but just there's a national level RDL, there's a provincial RDL, and how to be included in the RDL and what type of KOLs and experts you have to influence. But by and large, this process, whether your drug can be included or not in the RDL, is really not up to you because you are not invited to participate. It's a sort of a top-down approach. But experts, clinical experts, pharmacy and health economic experts, they will be invited to issue their opinions and to vote to make decisions, so really influencing the KOLs. Really materials needed or data needed, clinical need, efficacy, safety, price, and how many years or time on market, cost effectiveness. The next slide, please.
Yeah, we want to pick up the speed a little, don't we?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. Yep. There's lots of material here. Well, we can probably move to the next slide. Really, I think this slide and next slide very similar. Really, okay. Well, let's come back. I'm sorry, to the previous one. Yeah, just the steps. How the government, Ministry of really the Human Resources and Social Security, how they manage the process. About every 4 years, they update the national RDL. So next slide, please. The materials you need to submit there, disease, product, and reimbursement status here, really if the drug was reimbursed before or not, and whether the drug is reimbursed overseas or not. So, as we mentioned, really, you are not invited to participate. So you have to really nurture, your advocacies, your advocates and experts to really sing your song and to sort of support your product. Yeah, this is the slide very similar to the previous one, just visually showing it starts from where and ends where, 4 major steps. and you have little control at the beginning, and you have no control when it's closed door session. So what you can do is during step 2, really the consultants and experts just make sure they are very familiar with your products and they actually support and they can advocate your products during the closed door sessions and discussions. Okay, the next slide. The importance of consultants here. Just start this relationship building with KOLs as early as possible. It's at least 1 year, but really many times just years ago. Next slide, please. Another way to try to simplify and visualize what is this RDL. So here on this chart, there's national RDL, there's a list A and list B. Similar to the U.S. situation, but U.S., there's a, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, but everything is, private commercial programs. Here, this is government-funded program. List A and List B. List A, basically, the very basic, generic, and they're very cheap. And all products on List A by NRDL, they're mandatory. No provinces, they can change that. They have to implement that. But List B is sort of a recommended or directional, it's a guidance. And different provinces, they can take the national RDL List B, and based on their own situation, they have the room to adjust 15% really quantity in terms of the number of the drugs. They may add or they may delete 15%. The green bar really shows the copay versus reimbursed amount, that proportion. It used to be even on List B, maybe the government would pay 70 to 80%. It's not the case anymore. The government tried to include more and more drugs in List B. They're under some pressure, political pressure and some other social pressure. Hey, we include these drugs in List B, but the patient has to pay very high copay for some highly innovative, very expensive drugs. So the copay range can be very, very large. That's the RDL versus PRDL. The RDL evaluation, that's the PRDL, the provincial RDL, really regarding the List B. If you think your product may have a chance, if it's not on the national RDL, but you think your product may have a chance on the PRDL, you can try to get listed on List B in the provincial RDL, but you have to approach those provinces one by one. Usually, in your home or host province, if the company is based in, for example, in Shanghai, then you try Shanghai, you may have greater chance to get listed there than other places. But the 15% is really not a large room for, to be listed. It's 15% usually is reserved for some high-profile categories, therapeutic areas or drug categories. Okay, that's the provincial RDL process. Next step. Historically, how many versions already introduced? The last version was introduced, the third version, late 2009, the national RDL. Then all the provinces, they advised and finalized their own PRDL List B early 2010. So 4 to 5 years, if you have drug not included in the current RDL, if you have a drug you might want to bring to China right now, you really need to basically pay attention to the next round of the RDL update. So the next round would be sometime in 2013 to 2014-ish. Okay, next slide. The next section, we're not going to going through this in detail. The EDL, the Essential Drug List system in China. I think it's very unique. In developing countries, I think it's quite common to really make sure everybody has access to the very basic essential drugs. That's really the history of EDL in China. The current EDL was developed and introduced in late 2009. If we can look at the next slide, please. And the drugs on EDL is quite consistent. They really overlap with drugs on the national RDL, the reimbursed drug list A drugs. So it's set by the price set basically by the NDRC. They're centralized at the provincial level in terms of the bidding and distribution, 100% reimbursed. And the rumor already started. The government will introduce the 2012 version of the EDL. Some companies really got a little scared or concerned. The government actually would like to introduce more innovative drugs in EDL. If you are included in EDL, many times company readers, hopefully my drug's not included in EDL, because if it's included, means the price will be really cut substantially. Okay, so that's the EDL system in China. I think that really applies to more generic drugs rather than innovative, but we'll see what's going to happen this year with the new version of the EDL. Reimbursement in China. So we talk about pricing, then we'll talk about who pays this. This charts just different countries, and look at the first column, China. So basically, you have the government, the lighter blue bar. Government pays up to 50%. And the self-pay components about another 50%. The yellow, the orange-ish, that's the private insurance. So it's a very different mechanism versus what's going on in the U.S. So who pays for drugs in China? Next slide, please. The whole insurance structure here, based on who you are. If you live in urban, your employee versus if you live in urban but you don't work, either retiree or student or whatsoever, that's the BMN urban employees versus residents. If you live on a farm, so that's another structure. So basically, three major programs, who covered by what program, who funds what programs, and the coverage. The coverage there, actually, it has really improved dramatically, even in the last 2 to 3 something years. The ceiling every year per insured, how much covered. And this slide really shows really essentially almost 95% all Chinese population. Everybody is almost covered by the basic government insurance program. The next slide, please. What's the trend? Really, lots of private insurance companies would like to participate in medical insurance. They're sort of not allowed right now. They're basically play a more supplementary role right now. But moving forward, we know the government would like to have them participate, but the government has to really work on some really good policies to invite the private sector's participation in that. DRG-based drug, the disease-related groups, so really manage the overall cost, then give you the freedom to choose different procedures and different drug therapies. So that's really the medical insurance landscape now and moving forward. And in summary, it comes to when it comes to pricing reimbursement, it can be confusing. I know RDL, so we just want to highlight here. RDL is product specific, not brand. So, for instance, if you have a statin. The statin may be included in RDL, but if you have the same molecule, but you are a new brand, well, basically your molecule or your brand already included in the RDL. Then you have to work on the whole tendering bidding process and hospital listing. But if your NME, no one else has the molecule in the market, then you are not included in the RDL. You have to work the RDL system on your own. Or, you are a brand with a molecule. The molecule, there are maybe 5, 10 players in China already, but this molecule is not on the RDL, so you are not on the RDL. So the product versus brand sometimes can be confusing here. We talk about list fee, the reimbursement ratio, and really more and more, I think Chinese companies and foreign companies in particular really asking themselves the question, is it better off always to be on the RDL list? Or perhaps you may have more freedom to play if you are not on the RDL. So with reimbursement, how many patients you can get, and without reimbursement, how many patients you can get, and what price points you can set. And also price volume trade-off for some maybe low-end products. So really, that's some of the hot topics going on, and different players are really strategizing along. Tendering, bidding, hospital listing, just a few slides. We're not going to talk about all the details, really. This slide on 56, the tendering process, it happens at all the provincial levels, going through this province by province, what you need to do. The documents you need to submit, and they set the retail price rather than they set the ex-factory price, and how you can work together with local distributors to go through the whole the tendering and bidding process. There's also cycle, really done once or twice a year at different provinces, and it's not, hey, I have a product, I just submit and get an independent or individual review. No, you have to catch up with the bus. Then we talk about there's a trend, and the central government may consider to control more drugs in terms of pricing, and to even have national level bidding process. That's the bidding. The next slide, really high level, what's going on at hospital. Within the hospitals, if you are selected by a local government, hey, your price can be accepted. I would like to carry your product. That's not guaranteed. Or the hospitals will list your product, so you have to go through the hospital listing. Again, one by one, hospital by hospital. So you have to strategize. What are the high potential hospitals for the disease area for my product? Then just if you select those hospitals, then work through the listing process. There's a review and approval cycle once or twice a year, similar to the U.S. P&T committee with all the large hospitals. So that's it takes a long time, 3 to 5 months per review. So that's the hospital listing. So you have to go through all of this until the product is listed by that particular hospital. Then you would send out your commercial team, sales reps, and you would start to do marketing and get your product prescribed by the physicians in that hospital. I think that's probably, I know there are lots of stuff, lots of nitty-gritties. We just don't have time to really talk about all of that. The time is about
thank you very much. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Covered lots of information on the regulatory product registration reimbursement process in China. And thanks again for staying up till around 1 a.m. now in Beijing, China. We're now going to have we're going to now have the questions and answer period. If you have some questions, please send us the questions through the chat box. And we've already received quite a few questions. So why don't you take a sip of water, Donghui, and then we'll start the questions.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question is, what is the importance of the reference country for import registration? What is the importance of the reference country for import registration?
So reference country, how important a reference country can be for import. Yeah. So basically, for every imported drug to go through the registration, you need to have the CPP, the Certificate of Pharmaceutical Product. So that's the CPP required in China. And you basically, in the CPP, you would need to have the approved dose and the claim. And if the manufacturing site, for instance, if the manufacturing site is in, for instance, in France, you better need to have the CPP from France. So that just makes sure the origin of the CPP need to be consistent with the manufacturing site.
Okay, great. Is there a list of approved countries which the SFDA will accept a CPP from? Is there a list of approved countries which the SFDA will accept a CPP from?
Not really. No preferred or approved whatsoever. So basically, the SFDA here follows the standard, the WHO format. So as long as the CPP meets the WHO format, so that should be fine. That really should be fine. Then, obviously, in terms of quality and in terms of really also the integrity of clinical data, it's unspoken. The SFDA here would say, hey, the better you have more, just CPP from developed countries, from Western societies. EMEA, Canada, Japan, US, Australia, and Japan. So that's really the situation in China.
Okay, the next question, how early can you start the reimbursement process prior to SFDA approval? So how early should you start the reimbursement process prior to the SFDA approval?
Well, unofficially or informally with experts and KOLs, the earlier the better. And I think the good thing is those PIs or those investigators involved in clinical development, and most of them, they're also basically in the government's expert database. So very likely they would be invited to participate in reimbursement discussion. So those informal networking or nurturing, whatsoever we call that, the KOL relationship, you can start anytime. The earlier, the better. Then yet with the official RDL development, you already said, drug companies, you're not even invited to be there. So start with KOLs, the earlier the better. There's no regulation on that anyway.
Okay, next question, I don't know if you can answer it, but it says, what fraction of INDs approved under the imported drug category, I guess on the chart, were therapeutic biologics, monoclonal antibodies? So what fraction of the INDs approved under the import drug category were therapeutic biologics or monoclonal antibodies? I don't know if
there are some detailed data. I don't have those data with me now, but my recollection, in general now, the INDs in China, IND approved in China, about 20 to 30%, they are biologics. Okay? So about 20 to 30% they are biologics. Then, I don't have that figure with me among the biologics, what's the antibodies. But that number, that figure, that information actually can be obtained.
Okay.
But I don't just have,
Okay, I just want to mention to the attendees again, we're going to be sending out an evaluation form at the end of the webcast. We appreciate your feedback for that. Okay, the next question is, any regulations on combination product, for example, drugs and devices, drug-device combo?
Okay, combination first. Remember when we went through the 5 or 6 classes under new product classification, there's a combo there. But your combo can go to maybe class 3 or class 5. It really also depends on other parameters, indication, claims, indication also, for instance, subpopulation. If you have the identical populations or different subpopulations, okay? Drug-device combination is quite vague in China. In the past, it would be part of the device division, but right now it more would go to drugs. But there isn't a clear cut, and also there's some situations or some cases, maybe a medical device grade product overseas, but in China, the Chinese SFDA would say that is not a medical device in China; it is a drug.
Right, so that's
that
where,
really would go case by case. Huh?
Yeah, that's where a product, if it's a device overseas and it meets device regulations, and then in China it's qualified as a drug, classified as a drug, then the manufacturer oftentimes doesn't have the documents to meet drug registration requirements.
Yep.
Okay, this question says, in regards to 33 kinds of supplements, can we locate them in English on the SFDA webpage? In regards to 33 kinds of supplements, can we locate them in English on the SFDA webpage?
I know there's Chinese version for sure. Most of the guidelines, those regulation documents, the main body of the documents, they are available in both Chinese and English. Then sometimes some of the details, there's English version and sometimes there isn't.
Okay. The next question is, do you have to conduct a clinical trial in China in order to obtain marketing approval in China? Do you have to conduct a clinical trial in China in order to obtain marketing approval in China?
Well, in general, yes. If it's not, if you're a generic product, that basically is the bioequivalency study. It's not sort of a clinical trial, clinical development. But if you're not generic, you would have to do some clinical trials in China. But the scope, the size of the trials, how many patients and what data you need to gather, again, it depends on the classification of the new drug.
Right, and how much foreign data you have.
And how much foreign data you have, and basically also how, the data you already have and how much of that is based on Chinese population.
Okay, the next question says, do you foresee any reinforcement of post-marketing surveillance activities? Do you foresee any reinforcement, or I guess, are there any additional measures put in for post-marketing surveillance?
Well, is it safety, or it's about drug safety, or it's more about maybe, marketing and sales? But let's say it's on safety. I think China is doing much better job on post-marketing surveillance on drug safety. The AE reporting, the SAE reporting, there are fair, detailed regulation what you need to do. And basically, for the first 5 years post-approval, you need to do that very diligently. Then, after the 5 years, you only need to report the new types of AEs, for instance, and SAEs and death, for sure. But on safety, post-marketing surveillance is, I think the government is doing much better job now. But I'm not sure whether the question also included, hey, what's going on with what I can do with promotion sales activities. Yes, there's regulation on that as well, but just more gray there. Perhaps it's less about reps and individual reps with individual doctors. Maybe it's more from company to a hospital or a company to a local government, where there's maybe kind of a, bribing things going on.
Okay, next question. Can you identify the key elements that the SFDA will be looking for in the proposed Chinese label and package insert? Can you identify the key elements that the SFDA will be looking for in the proposed Chinese label and package insert?
Well, the Chinese label and packaging insert, actually the packaging insert in China for prescription drugs, very, very concise and very simple. Lots of fairly detailed information, let's say the PI information in U.S., they are not included in China, but you need to submit. Then regarding the label, I think the government really is more about the indication, what disease, what specific disease, and what specific subpopulation. So I think that's where just, they really want to make sure the indication on the label is almost identical in China versus what it has been overseas. Then in submission, as I say, you need to basically submit everything you have overseas, but they do not always necessarily appear in the Chinese label or in the Chinese packaging insert. I'm not sure whether that was the question or there are some other elements.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. What types of testing might be done during local testing for both products? I don't know what the animal toxicology testing, biocompatibility testing, quality testing, etc. So what types of testing might be done during local testing for both products? Animal toxicology testing, biocompatibility testing, and quality testing.
I think quality testing, let's take it out. Quality testing, that's really part of the whole, the CMC component, and maybe under GMP, if this is an imported drug, and you really have to submit everything you have from overseas, and they not necessarily local testing, but you need to submit, different batches, really where the product is produced, rather than, right? Was that a question? I think it's where it is produced in terms of local testing. Then regarding other things like, PK or, preclinical or toxicology whatsoever, we can sort of go back to the slides we had before. They're fair detailed listed out under, for instance, PK, what you need to do, under, toxicology, what you need to do. There's maybe carcinogenic test, maybe reproductive tox test. So there is, based on your product classification, new drug classification, the list will be provided to you.
Okay, the next question is, are there ways to influence which testing center is chosen? Are there ways to influence which testing center is chosen in China?
Well, I think one is whether you want to influence, another is really just say, well, one is you want to influence, but, I think there are really not many choices anyway. Local testing, for instance, there's one in Shanghai, the Shanghai Institute for Drug Products. You really just basically, because a lot of the products eventually, the importing process will be done through the Shanghai port. So after you got the SFDA approval, then, you better have the whole, the local testing center, you chose that the same place versus where in the future the product will actually imported. So, where the product will be imported, the site of the port versus the site of the testing center. So we just used the example here, the Shanghai Institute for Drug Products.
Okay, next question. What are the clinical trial requirements in China? What are the clinical trial requirements in China? It's a pretty general question, but...
Yeah, it's also very general here. Based on what we provided on those slides, there's a list of requirements by the government. If it's class 1, what are the requirements you need to have? And if it's class 5, what the detailed stuff you need to do. Then, bioequivalency, for instance, maybe for just, class 5 should be fine, then for sure for generic should be fine. And whether this is RX or versus this is OTC. And actually OTC in China, basically, you cannot register a new product as an OTC. You just OTCs, they're all basically switched or converted from RX.
Okay. What are the registration issues for generic versus new drugs? What are the registration issues for generic versus new drugs? Registration
issue for generic versus new, really for a imported new drug, I think the process is quite similar for a imported new versus generic. And especially now, the government here in China really almost like disencourage too many generic products introduced in the China market. So actually the approval rate of generic drug is getting lower and lower. The government really doesn't want to get too many of those on the market, so maybe about 50 and 60%. And the CTD files, is especially you need to pay attention to the integrity, the quality, in the CTD file, the CTD5 and different modules there, and the module 3, for instance, just make sure the quality is there. Otherwise, if you have an imported generic, especially for generic, if the government wants to say, hey, this is a good generic, we should approve it, I believe the local players, they would have better chance than a foreign players for imported product.
Okay, the next question is, how is the quality of CROs in China these days? Can you update us on CROs in China?
Well, CROs in China now, it has gone through really, from non-existent to like exploding growth and now consolidation. There may be, about a few hundred both in China, then some of them they're small, but actually many of them they have become larger and larger. And they're basically local CROs, and you also have local operations or local branches of some well-known global CRO players like Quintiles and PPDs and so on. Local CROs and international CROs, they all have their strengths, pros and cons. The local CROs, they're really getting stronger and stronger in China because they're just the local networking and really getting, to understand new information and how to interpret the new information, the new direction, and networking with government officials and getting some really informal insight. That's really the local CROs, their strengths. On the other hand, there are really a lot of trials going on in China, and you can find CROs, but then the next question is really the integrity of trials and the integrity of data. So, global CRO versus local, I think there's a gap still with local players, especially nowadays about data management and biostatistical analysis and so on. Dossier preparation, perhaps the quality is not quite there yet. So local CROs, they know exactly what the government wants and needs, but the whole documentation and preparation, the SOP and integrity, I think global CROs, I think they still have their strengths in those areas.
Okay, the next question. Are traditional Chinese medicines more easily approved in China compared to Western prescription products? Are traditional Chinese medicines more easily approved when they're compared to Western prescription products in China?
The answer is almost like for sure, yes. But on the other hand, they're subject to different divisions. The TCMs really managed by the TCM division, and small molecules and biologics, there are two other divisions. And really, with TCMs, because of the history and the philosophy there, the TCMs in China, they work, many times very well, but they really don't have that kind of an evidence-based philosophy there. So the TCM division, when they review and approve a TCM new product, the standard is very different from, what you need to do, what you must do with a Western drug. So I think that the bar is somehow lower for TCMs. But the government also is trying very hard to modernize and upgrade TCM products. Maybe on clinical trials, on evidence-based medicine is not there yet, but the government is really raising the bar higher and higher on quality on manufacturing. But I would say really no need, for instance, for a Western drug player to see, hey, am I at a disadvantage versus a TCM product?
Okay, I think the last question today and the last one we have here is the Chinese government enforcing a no kickback policy with drug sales? Do you know of any drug companies that might have been caught? What were the penalties for kickbacks?
Well, the government will for sure say yes, no kickback. But I think I mentioned that already. It's very gray, and it's it's unspoken rule, and it's the rule of the game. It is going on, but it's difficult on the other hand to be caught at individual level. For instance, from a sales rep to another from a sales rep to a doctor, but companies, either local companies or foreign companies, you need to be very careful. Sort of a business to business, from your company to this province, those government agencies to different hospitals. You need to make sure that sort of is at the level of corruption, but at doctor level it's more kind of a kickback. So that's the situation, and many companies, drug companies, they also let like distributors, really the national distributor, to manage some of the cash movement. So it doesn't even have to appear on your book. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation. By law say no, but it is going on. You almost have to do that anyway.
Okay, Don, we thank you so much again for your presentation and the Q&A period. We know it's 1:30 a.m. in China today, in Beijing, so get some sleep, and thanks again.
Okay, you're welcome.
And thanks for the audience for attending today. My name is Ames Gross. The company is Pacific Bridge Medical. You can learn more about the company at our website at pacificbridgemedical.com. We will be sending out some evaluation forms, and we also look forward to you attending our next webcast. Thank you very much, and the webcast is now